First of all, I would like to welcome everyone to our online seminar, The African Union Between Pan-Africanism and Subsidiarity. My name is Jonathan Ponvik. I am a member of the extended board of the Academic Association for Security Studies, and I'm a member of the Academy Department. Before we begin, I would like to yield the floor to my colleague, Ms. Conrad. She's going to introduce the association in detail.
My name is Lynda Conrad. I'm the Deputy Chairwoman of the Academic Association for Security Studies. In this position, I am tasked with organizing basic and advanced level academies on security studies. Since they are now taking place digitally, we have extended our program to include online seminars like this one as well. The Academic Association for Security Studies is the biggest student network for security studies in Germany, as well as the umbrella organization for 25 groups at local universities. We are an organization by students for students. It is our explicit mission to be a facilitator for academic discourse on security policy at German universities. You can find additional information on our work on our website, www.sicherheitspolitik.de, which unfortunately mainly operates in German, but you can also find us on social media. I am very delighted to welcome Dr. Iroulo today and listen in on this interesting discussion. And now I yield the word back to Jonathan.
Thank you very much. Before we begin our seminar, I would like to give a few comments on technical issues. First of all, the chat is going to be deactivated. We kindly ask you to use the following tools to interact with us and participate in the discussion, which will follow after our speaker has finished her input. If you want to do so, you can use the raise your hand tool, or you can anonymously ask questions with the question and answer tool if you want to participate in our discussion. I will read out the questions if you ask them with the question and answer tool. As I mentioned, if you want to ask your questions in person, we ask you to use the raise your hand tool. If you have joined us via phone, you can use the *9 combination. When it is your turn, we will activate your microphone so that you can ask the question. Even though we would welcome it if questions are asked in English, you can ask questions in German as well, and I will translate them. If you experience technical problems, feel free to contact us with the question and answer tool. My colleague, Ms. Lynda Conrad, will try to assist you on solving it. If we can't help you with your technical issues, there are different things you can do. You can either restart Zoom, use it from a different device, call, close other applications, activate flight mode or other devices, and we ask you to run a test for your microphone and sound using the Zoom task line. Lastly, I would like to inform you that this online seminar is going to be recorded and will be uploaded later on. Now, I want to wholeheartedly welcome Dr. Lynda Iroulo, who has agreed to give us an input on the African Union, its origins and institutions, as well as on the African peace and security structure. Dr. Iroulo is working at the GIGA Institute for African Studies. She focuses on international and regional organizations and the African Union and global politics. Dr. Iroulo, thank you very much. We are delighted to have you. Before I yield the floor, I would like to start with a quick survey. The question is going to be, how much do you know about the African Union, its institution, and its mission? There are different options you have. You can either say, I know very much about it. I have this middle knowledge. I have little or very little knowledge. If you have no knowledge at all, you can use nothing. And if you don't know how much you know, you can use don't know. My colleague, Ms. Conrad, is going to close the survey as soon as all our participants have, or almost all of our participants have chosen an answer. Now we see that most of our participants have little knowledge, with some having middle knowledge and some having much knowledge. Dr. Iroulo, I want to start with my first question. What was the motivation for the foundation of the African Union, and what were important moments of the process?
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. It's a pleasure being here, an opportunity to speak about the African Union. I think the survey, it's really good to actually start off this conversation knowing that like there are a lot of people on the platform who don't know so much about the African Union. So I'd like to start like going back in history to kind of talk about, you know, the continent on itself, pre-colonial times. There is a work by Modoc where he kind of maps out about 834 ethnicities across Africa. And this is in pre-colonial times. So this was before there was the 1884-85 Scramble of Africa, which happened in Berlin, where, you know, European powers came together and kind of divided the continent among themselves. So you can imagine if, you know, we didn't have colonization, the amount of probably societies, or I don't know if we would be a nation state, but the amount of societies would have in the 21st century. So that on the side, the African Union was, you know, you can talk about the African Union without going back in history to argue for an internal awakening, something that I would call an internal awakening driven by external exposure. And I would like to, you know, differentiate this into two different issues. So the first, which is a work that I did as a young student, a master's student in Nigeria, I did an interview-based paper where I interviewed veterans of the Second World War. And a lot of the information that popped up from that research was that, you know, they went to war, fought alongside those who were considered our colonial masters, and realized that these people were humans like them. You know, they died, they shed blood. They were not superior like we're made to understand. So there was a lot of people who went and fought for the British, for the French during the Second World War, came back and started little groups of national movements. And you also see this in terms of, you know, African scholars or students who went out to study. There was a Kwame Nkrumah, the very well-known father of African Pan-Africanism, who went out to study a lot more African nationalists. There is Patrice Lumumba, Amilcar Cabral. These are Africans who went out to study, and in their, you know, interactions with the outside, and also interactions with, you know, Pan-Africanists of the 19th century, those who fought for the African-American liberation, there was this drive that led to, you know, the freedom of the continent. So, and I think all this fits in perfectly into the topic of Pan-Africanism and subsidiarity that you have, you know, labeled as the title for this talk. Pan-Africanism locates itself in the origins of African-American liberation, like I said, and its inspiration was to free Africans everywhere. The characteristics of this, you know, movement was based on a clear expression of the private achievements of Africans in pre-colonial times. And this was driven by, you know, scholars and historians, mostly European historians, who had studied the continent, not necessarily visited. In the 1830s, an example is the German philosopher G.H.F. Hegel, who remarked that Africa is no historical part of the world and has no movement or development to exhibit. So him and some other scholars like Hugh Trevor Roper, Marjorie Payham, like many others, wrote about the non-existence of history in Africa. So followed by, you know, all this, and then the idea of returning to Africa, and most importantly, colonization and a need to eradicate any form of neocolonization on the continent, led to, you know, the drive to create an organization to tackle these challenges. Ghana was the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence in 1958, and I remember Nkrumah's speech, where it's easily found online, where he said, independence is meaningless unless it is linked with the total liberation of Africa. So scholars had further described how this movement or philosophy of Pan-Africanism was institutionalized in 3 phases. Tim Muruthi talks about this, and he describes it as, the first stage being the Pan-African Congresses, which happened in 1900 to 1945. The second stage being the inauguration of the Organization of African Unity on May 25th, 1963. And then the third being the transformation of the Organization of African Unity to what we now have as the African Union in 2001. So the whole idea was to eradicate colonialism, neocolonialism from the African continent, and to encourage political and economic integration among its member states. For these, an organization was needed, and that organization became the Organization of African Unity, which is the African Union, came into effect in July 2002. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this input. Now, we have this African Union since 2002.
Mm-hmm.
How is this African Union structured? What are important bodies and committees which all of our participants have to know after this online seminar?
Okay, before I talk about the important bodies, I'd like to also highlight the crucial moments, or what I'll label a milestone, in the progress of the Organization of African Unity to the African Union. So these, for me, I would classify these into 3 important moments. The first being the decolonization of an apartheid. The organization was created for this reason. So all efforts were put into ensuring that the continent was decolonized, and regions that were under white minority rule were also free from apartheid. So they wasted no time, the OAU, the Organization of African Unity, in creating the Liberation Committee. This Liberation Committee was tasked with aiding colonial territories to gain independence. And it was recorded that it had assisted 16 colonial territories then to gain independence. The second phase being the conflicts and at independence. There were several civil wars, coups on the continent right after independence. And this became evident that the non-interference clause in the Organization of African Unity was an impediment to the success of the organization. In 1996, 14 of the 53 member states of the Organization of African Unity were all involved in civil wars, and about 8 million people were displaced. So the OAU failed, miserable, to some extent miserably in, curbing some very horrific conflicts on the continent. 3 of them, very crucial 3, being the first, Idi Amin's government in Uganda, Bokasa's government in the Central African Republic, and the genocide in Rwanda, which was a crucial reason why we moved away from indifference to non-indifference. And the third aspect I would like to raise is the transition of government. So between 1956 and 2001, in Africa, we had about 80 successful coups and 139 reported coups on the continent between 1956 and 2001. So from 2001, we saw a lot of governments started going through a transitional phase from military rule to civilian rule. And this also inspired the need to transform the institution from the Organization of African Unity to the African Union. This transformation led to several other institutions being created. There is the new Partnership for Africa's Development, which is called NEPAD. There was the Pan-African Parliament, the African Peer Review Mechanism, there's the African Governance Architecture, and subsequently the African Peace and Security Architecture. So the structure of, back to your question of the structure of the African Union is quite a complicated one, but I think the basic structure of the organization is what I would want to focus on, and not on the commission itself. So the commission being the secretariat, which is located in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. I cannot give a comprehensive description of the African Union. It is quite a colossal organization, but a basic description of those main components. It begins, at the highest level where the organization has the assembly. This assembly is made up of heads of states of different governments, and they are the highest decision-making body of the African Union. We have the Executive Council, made up of members from different member states. We have the STC, what we call the STC, and the PRC. So the STCs are specialized technical committees, and the PRC is permanent representative committees. So these are people who are assigned the task of aiding the Executive Council, which is made up of foreign ministers from different member states. And below that, we have the Peace and Security Council, which of course is in charge of, conflict resolution, management, and all that. And we have the African Commission, which is the main body of the Secretariat, made up of several other organs like the African Governance Architecture. That's also where you find the department of the Peace and Security Department. Below that, we have the Pan-African Parliament. We also have the Economic and Social Cultural Council, and then some judicial, human rights, and legal organs. So within that, we have the African Commission on Human and People Rights. We have also the African Court on Human and People's Rights. There are financial institutions, the African Development Bank, and many more of the financial institutions within the Union, and the African Peer Review Mechanism, which is an institution created to monitor good governance. And finally, we have the regional economic commissions across the continent that covers all the 5 regional groups of the African Union.
Great, thank you. I think that was a very comprehensive overview over a very complex structure. Now, you've already mentioned, I think once or twice, the African Peace and Security structure. Could you quickly explain what this structure is, and especially how does this African Peace and Security structure interact with different sub-regional bodies?
Yeah, so like I mentioned earlier, the Organization of African Unity was, one of the clauses of its charter was that there will be non-interference in the affairs of member states. And, amidst the conflicts that happened during the time of the Organization of the African Unity, there was no organ to cater to this. They came up with the central organ of the mechanism for conflict prevention, management, and resolution. The OAU organ was created to tackle ongoing conflicts in the region. But before that organ was created, there was a Commission on Mediation, Conciliation, and Arbitration, and also other ad hoc committees that were created in order to tackle conflicts that were ongoing at the time. One of the first conflicts they tackled was the Sand War between Algeria and Morocco, where Morocco was making claims to some of the territories in Algeria. And this was in 1963. So these legal commissions, these commissions were created, but however, because they were constrained by legal and resource issues, the legal aspects being the non-interference clause. So it was difficult to interfere, especially when the charter had that clause. And then there's also the limitation of resources. So they had to depend externally on resources. There was not much coming in from member states to fund such organs. So the peace and security architecture kind of came up as a way to provide a more robust mechanism than its predecessor, the organ of the mechanism, the central organ of the mechanism for conflict prevention, management, and resolution. So it was added as a, as a new organization, in the Constitutive Act of the African Union, Article 4, that there will be this organ established as a main pillar of the African peace and security architecture, which is the framework for promoting peace and security in Africa. This organ is assisted by several, so basically the organ is made up of 15 member states, and these member states have representatives. So the seats within the organ, the Peace and Security Council, is distributed across the 5 regional regions that we have on the continent. So that's, Central Africa, West Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa, and Northern Africa. And they are all assigned seats. So also the tenure of these member states in the Peace and Security Council is between 3 to 5 years. 5 years in order to ensure continuity in the agenda that they have put on the table. And the distribution has to do with the number of member states within each region. The chair nomination is different. So usually they nominate a chair every month based on an alphabetical order in English. And the Peace and Security Council Secretariat is located within the African Union Commission in Addis Ababa. So there is also a Peace and Security Department that helps, kind of smoothing the process of the organ. They interact with several regional bodies. Actually, they interact with most of the African Union organs. The Peace and Security Council is assisted by the African Union Commission, is assisted by the department that deals with continental early warning system, is assisted by the panel of the WISE, the African Standby Force, and the Peace Force. It also collaborates with regional economic commissions, so the Economic Community of West African States, the SADC, all these regional organizations, they also collaborate with them, and it also collaborates with regional mechanisms. It collaborates with, civil societies, other international organizations and countries, the European Union, the US, China, and the United Nations Security Council. The Peace and Security Council also has subsidiary bodies. So these bodies are made up of a committee of experts. These are usually just like African experts on security to assist the body. They also have a military staff, so made up of military personnel to advise on cases of military issues, and high-level panels. High-level panels are usually made up of about 3 former heads of states that come together and also assist the Peace and Security Council.
Great, thank you. Before we move on, I would like to introduce our second survey. It's going to ask our participants, if you think back on events on the African continent, major events, how often was the African Union mentioned as a relevant actor? Was it always or almost always? Was it sometimes or rarely? Or was it never? If you don't know, you can always choose don't know. Once again, my colleague, Ms. Conrad, is going to close the survey and present us the results as soon as the majority of our participants has made a choice. And afterwards, we will move on with our next question. So the African Union was 48% say sometimes, 39% say rarely. So I think just because this impression exists does not necessarily mean that the African Union didn't play a role in those conflicts. So how would you rate the effectiveness and the impact of the African Union so far in general, as well as in terms of peace and security?
Yeah, I'm really enjoying the survey because it gives me a glimpse as to, you know, what people know and what we should be talking about. I'm not surprised by that result because although the African Union and African states have been a part of global politics for a long time, they haven't really been featured in a lot of conversation, especially within academia. So that's why you see, you know, a little visibility when it comes to African member states or the African Union. So in terms of effectiveness of the union, it's difficult to kind of rate an effectiveness because there are several other factors that needs to come into play that should be thought about in order to effectively rate effectiveness. So I would rather want to focus on some of the maybe strengths and failures of the African Union. And there are so many of them, but there are just major ones that I would want to point on. So maybe I'll start with the good stuff. So strengths. Enhancing the agency of Africa. This is something that the African Union has played a crucial role. For those studying security, especially if you want to study, you know, security in the perspective of the African Union, it is important to consider the collectivity aspect of the African Union. So when I say collectivity, I'm talking about preference formation, consensus through decision making, and the solidarity norm. So the African Union was created as a way for African member states to have a single voice in global affairs. And this is what they've been pushing to achieve. They have, you know, in several ways used their voice actively in international fora. One of them being, especially in terms of peace and security, is to ensure that the United Nations provides funding for peace missions in Africa. Because if the UN makes the argument that security is of utmost importance, then at the end of the day, the African Union is also assisting it in doing that on the continent. So they are actively pushing for more funding for peace missions on the continent from the United Nations. Another instance that I'd like to give in terms of the agency of the African Union is also its, you know, assertive roles in international issues. A very important one, which a lot of us may have heard, was you know, the feud with the International Criminal Court, especially when there was an arrest warrant for al-Bashir, and that led to a lot of conversation about how, you know, the ICC's role or peacekeeping role is kind of skewed towards what the United Nations Security Council tells it to do, and how it's very much discriminatory in its enforcement of its power. And then they've also been quite, you know, quite unified in choosing people to take on positions at international organizations. So I know that the African Union is one organization where they present one candidate to take on a position in international organizations. They try not to present several candidates in order to instead of ending up with a contestation of who is it we're going to have there. There is an agreement at the African Union first on who to present as a candidate for a position at any regional international organization. In terms of norm entrepreneurship, there is a lot that isn't said about the organization. So, you know, back during the decolonial movements, African nations were the first to, you know, talk about the need for every region or society to have a right to self-determination. And this led to a lot of conversation on individual and group rights. They have been effective also in peacemaking, in talking about, you know, from moving the member states from a form of indifference to non-indifference. So now we do not see them folding their hands when it comes to conflict in the continent. There is a need for a concerted effort to find a way to resolve a conflict. There are still some flaws in terms of responding to these conflicts very quickly. But however, they must be applauded for moving away from this, you know, clause of non-interference to a clause of non-indifference. Another point that I'd like to raise is also in kind of regulating state behaviors. So member states are, you know, pushed now or persuaded, maybe the better word to choose, to implement some of the decisions made. Usually the challenge that we have with the African Union is that it's been a saying institution and not really a doing institution. So we have these amazing treaties and norms and rules being signed, but nobody is really actively implementing them. So there is a more, you know, active push to get governments to implement some of this, state behaviors, some of these decisions that are made within the government. In terms of norm making, I would also like to raise the, you know, the Common Defense Pact, which is it's one of the first pacts that came into play in international law as a way to kind of dissuade governments from, you know, committing coups, from cases of genocide and violent conflicts in the nation. So this is also somewhere they have, you know, made strides. There is the anti-coup norm, which was signed in 1998 in Harare. There is also their role in the gender and women's rights. They have implemented decisions, which is also a global first, and, you know, the right of the woman to abortion, the self-protection and issues of genital mutilation. So these are things that we see them actively doing, and they have achieved some level of success in doing that. And in terms of weaknesses, I have spoken about, you know, them being a saying institution and not a doing institution. So that's one of the major weaknesses of the African Union, that there are several treaties signed, but there is a lack of commitment to implementing those decisions. So it's difficult to think about a way to resolve this situation or challenge, but it remains a challenge of the African Union, and it's something they're still trying to tackle. It's still not a people-centered organization, which is something that they have, you know, put forward as a very important aspect of the organization. They have tried to reach out to ground level Africans to hear about, you know, what their expectations are. But the problem in those cases is that there is still a lot of elite capture, where most of these people are people who know something about the organization. So people like me who are researchers who research the African Union, but someone, you know, in their farm somewhere in, you know, Nigeria would probably have no clue what the African Union is about. There is also a lack of accountability. So the African Union itself is only accountable to member states. A lot of the people at the grassroots know nothing about the African Union. And then also in terms of the government itself, there is lack of accountability because there is a form of soft power approach that the organization takes. So we see a lot going on. For instance, there is, I don't know if some of you have heard about what's going on in Zimbabwe, activists who are being, brutally beaten on the streets, some arrested. From what I know, there are talks about it at several sub-regional organizations, but we see nothing actively being done about these things. There was also the issue of the slavery in Libya that the African Union should have known about, but kept quiet about it for a long time. So these are some of the weaknesses of the organization in terms of accountability. There is also a lack of, aiding in intra-regional trade. So there are statistics of inter-regional trade within Europe, within Asia and Latin America, and when it comes to Africa, there is, I think, about below 10% intra-regional trade going on. So this was what led to the signing or ratification of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. However, the pandemic has put a hold on that as well. The one major challenge of the African Union remains dependence on external donors. This is something that has been spoken about for several years, and they're still talking about this. The last I checked, about 90% or so of funding for peace and security comes from outside. So bureaucrats within this organization have argued that this has been a challenge for them in consolidating their agency. So sometimes they have to deal with the demands of external actors because, like the saying goes, whoever plays the piper dictates the tune. So it remains a major challenge. There are reforms going on now. There was a 2018 reform that was just signed and not implemented yet, but signed. And one of the major changes to be made through the reform is to implement a 0.2 levy on imports. So the idea is to use this to kind of boost the African Union's financial resources to minimize the dependence on external actors. So these are like the major strengths and weaknesses that the organization has at the moment. But a major one that scholars are not really talking about, policy makers are not really talking about, that I'd like to put out there is going back to deal with our, colonial psychological trauma, if you can call it that. It's something that we haven't, really dealt with or spoken about. There is a lot going on now on the Black Lives Matter, and we as Africans tend to think that it's only an issue with, those who are interacting with the core, and forget that we had that interaction in the past that has put us in the situation that we are. And we are yet to talk about that, the colonial trauma, the colonial psychological trauma that the continent is facing. This is why we go to South Africa and then there is xenophobia, and you wonder why there is violence, African on African violence going on. So yeah, these are the major strengths and weaknesses that I would like to point. There are many more that I cannot all cover in this talk, but I think it's the basic to start with, just to know, where the African Union stands at this point.
Yeah, great. So I would ask my colleague to introduce the last survey. I want to take a look into the future and ask our participants, on the basis of everything they might have known and everything they have heard now, in what area do you think can the African Union have a positive impact on its member states? as well as in global politics. This is a multiple choice survey, so you can choose as many options as you like. Can the African Union have a positive impact in security policy, economy and trade, society, democracy and governance, and the rule of law? If you think all of them, then you can choose all of them. If you think none of the above, you can also choose that option. Once again, if my colleague sees that most of the participants have chosen their option, she will close the survey and present us the results. I think that's a very, very interesting result. Economy and trade, 88%, 35 from 40, security policy. How big do you think is the potential of the African Union as actor in global politics? And there's the saying that one organization can only be good in a few things. Are there specific areas, for example, economy and trade, in which the institution can or is better than in others?
Okay, that's also a very interesting result. And I find it interesting because there is less response or agreement on its potential or contributions to the rule of law. And I find that interesting because if we go back in history, there has been, like I mentioned, a lot of contribution that the continent has made to international law in general. But unfortunately, this has not been recognized. So we can talk about some of the things that I already mentioned, you know, the first in terms of the anti-coup norm in 1998, which was kind of signed in order to ensure that governments did not, there were repercussions for carrying out coup. We know that there was a few, I believe last week, there was not a coup in Mali. And right now, the African Union has also suspended the country until further notice. So there is that, and like I also mentioned, you know, the gender and women's rights, which they have actively signed off things that are global firsts that we don't see at the United Nations. The fact that the Africans like fought for decolonization, right to self-determination, contributed to individual and group rights across the world. And remaining, you know, I just want to go, you know, back to pre-colonial times. Like we have made a lot of contribution to global politics. In terms of economy, Africa has about 90% of natural resources, like all natural resources in the world. And these include diamonds, gold, iron, copper, uranium, bauxite. I can go on and on. And some of these are the natural resources that make the so-called developed nations what they are today. These were, you know, exploited and taken away to build the beautiful things that we see in European nations today. And in terms of government, the African Union created the African Peer Review Mechanism. So this is an organization that came in sometime in 2003. First, it was the New Partnership for Africa's Development organization created to ensure, to come up with the right development strategy for the continent. And this was after there was a backlash on the structural adjustment programs that were imposed by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund at the time. So this was a way to kind of create an agency for Africa to make decisions of its own, to find policies that were better suited for their development. And this led to the creation of the African Peer Review Mechanism, which in turn was a flagship program of the NEPAD. The NEPAD is now called African Union's Development Agency, by the way. So that these monitoring institution ensures that, you know, the good governance policies that are being prescribed by the African Union Development Agency are, you know, implemented within different member states. And it's interesting because this is the first time in the world where we find a monitoring institution focused on monitoring good governance. In terms of culture, I want to be a little controversial on that as well. I'm sure you followed international news where we have thousands of African artifacts still gracing the museums of, you know, European and like some American museums. So like these are, you know, contributions to society that unfortunately is not visible on the continent, but, you know, it's making its own contribution in other nations. Yeah. So, and in global politics as of today, I want to talk about the bargaining power. So where the African Union gets it wrong is that it forgets to see the bargaining power that it has. Like I mentioned, a lot of the resources, which till today many powers are still grappling to get, is a strong bargaining power that we could use for negotiations, but that is not being leveraged in terms of when we talk about, you know, international negotiations. We're not leveraging that as a unit. Based on my research and, you know, interview-based work that I've done so far, one of the challenges of some of the practitioners of the African Union is that although there is this solidarity norm and a need to make decisions as a single unit, there is still bilateral agreements being signed between different member states and external member states. And this becomes a problem because you cannot you know, be adamant on a decision or a position or a preference when you have bilateral engagements going on. So in terms of representation at the UN, you know, we also see how they have had a, you know, a single voice in presenting one candidate for any position at international organizations. So these are some of the things. I think what you know, international organizations can learn from the African Union, I would say, is in its Peace and Security Council. It's the irony being that, you know, the United Nations Security Council has been portrayed as a liberal institution, the democratic institution, but however, the council still doesn't represent the people that we find in the world. So the African group makes up 28% of member states in the United Nations, but still has no permanent seat at the United Nations Council. So for an international organization that talks about, you know, like a liberal world, it still doesn't, we don't visibly see a representation of the different peoples of the world within the United Nations Security Council. However, in the Peace and Security Council, we find, you know, where we have 15 seats within the council, regularly rotated between 3 to 5 years, and every member state having equal power within this council. So nobody has a permanent seat within the African peace and security architecture. It rotates, and like member states are being changed. And I think, you know, if that same mindset or that same institutional design is applied to the United Nations Security Council, I think better decisions will come out from issues of peace and security. So generally, like, and I think the issue of the spaces that we find ourselves in representation it's a huge challenge in any sector that you go to. You know, if you're a Hollywood freak like I am sometimes with watching Hollywood movies, you would know that the conversation in the Hollywood space is also representation, that the people who work within those sectors do not represent the peoples of the United States. It's the same in academia. You know, the people who occupy, you know, the higher position, who are well known in research, are not necessarily always people who look like me. And it's the same in international organizations, where the top positions and like the highest positions are held by, you know, people who do not necessarily look like me. So it's representation is something that is still lacking, especially within the United Security Council, and something that they can, you know, I think, you know, they could learn from the African Peace and Security Council in changing the institutional design of the United Nations Security Council.
Thank you very much for those insights. I think that all of our participants were able to learn something new about this very complex field. I think we're having a great starting point for our discussion. Starting now, all of our participants can use the raise your hand tool and the question and answer tool to ask questions to Dr. Iroulo, or you can also just share your opinions at the matter at hand. If you're using a phone, use *9. However, we would kindly ask you to introduce yourself, to formulate a brief and clear question. We're also having our first question from Alex Müller. I think your microphone should get activated right away.
Hey there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Then thank you very much, first of all, for this very interesting talk, for the insights you've provided. And I have a question regarding the shortcomings of the African Union, since you mentioned that it somehow lacks coherence to the people, so some democratic accountability. I was wondering if in the civil society there is some kind of narrative about African cohesion on the political level. So I'm thinking of the European Union, for example. In the early days of the European Union, many decision makers and people in civil society were thinking of that federal idea of once having the United States of Europe, so to speak, and the EU with its supranational structure just being a first step towards that. So I'm wondering if this is somehow the same in Africa with the African Union, especially given that principle of subsidiarity, where you have all the regional institutions like ECOWAS or all those things. So could you maybe elaborate a bit on that?
So if I get your question correctly, are you asking if there is a chance of a unification of the continent?
No, I'm asking if there is a greater narrative in the decision makers in the African Union to gradually get towards that step. So I'm not implying that eventually we will have Africa as one country, like we will have Europe as one country, because I would simply consider that unrealistic anyway. But I'm just thinking if there's a general idea of that to work towards a deepening cooperation in any policy field, since especially we had that survey like where the African Union can be very powerful. So I'm just thinking that such a narrative could be very pushing towards a deepening cooperation.
So thanks for your question. Actually, I would have to also go back in history to answer that question, because it's a conversation that started when the Organization of African Unity was about to come into being in 1963. So there was two factions at the time. One was more, gradualist, in the sense that they wanted a more economic cooperation first. And the other was more radical in the sense that they wanted a political unification. So, and Kwame Nkrumah, the former president, the first president of Ghana, was one of the leading figures in pushing for a unification of Africa. And that was a conversation, and at the end of the day, the consensus was that, we would rather start gradually, start with an economic integration, and then graduate into a political integration. And then again, sometime in 2001, Muammar Gaddafi also presented a report for a unification, the same arguments that Nkrumah made a few years ago on the unification of the continent. So he suggested a United States of Africa, which would be, he said would be similar to the current United States of America, or a Union of Africa, which would be similar to the Soviet Union. But at a time, it was also, kicked aside, and the decision was to not focus on that, but to also gradually bring the member states together. So that conversation has been on and off within the African Union. But however, the consensus has remained for a gradual cooperation. So that's why you see some of these institutions that were created right after the transformation of the OAU to the AU. So institutions like the African Governance Architecture to kind of coordinate governance, and then now we have the African Continental Free Trade Agreement in order to push for more intra-regional trade between member states. So if in the future, if there will be any unification, I don't know, but I can categorically tell you that the topic is still on the table. And for personal views, I would say Africa will be better off being a unified, entity. So a United States of Africa, but like a unified entity, I think the African Union or African member states would be better off that way. In that way, it will be easier to kick off any bilateral negotiations or interactions going on, and be able to stand as a unified entity and negotiate as one single country or region. But I'm a very Pan-Africanist in that sense.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Great. And we have one question in the question answer tool. How can the African Union become as visible in African countries as the EU is in Europe?
Yeah, I'm not an EU expert, but from what I hear from EU experts, I think they have still not gotten there yet, even till today, that every single European citizen knows about the European Union. And although like the EU is far ahead than the African Union, it's still a challenge. And the reason, like I said, why we still have this challenge is that there is an elite capture. So the people who know about the African Union are people like me who are researching the African Union, or people who work for the government, civil society, NGOs. So the layman with his little kiosks on the street will probably won't know what the African Union is all about. The farmer in my village wouldn't know what the African Union is all about. So, it also has to do with the lack of, relevant resources needed to ensure that there is a sensitization of people of the African, of the knowledge of the African Union. So, we don't there is a lack of, will I say, information on the part of the African Union. So I would advise that there is a need for the African Union to actively go into rural areas, remote areas, to sensitize people of the African Union, and maybe use like resources other than the internet, because basing information or interacting with stakeholders on such platforms is difficult, because internet is not easily accessible in every nook and cranny of the continent. So yeah, that will be my position, that there should be active engagement with non-elites, and in order to reach non-elites, there has to be some form of organization, volunteer work, to go into spaces where people do not necessarily know what the African Union is all about.
Thank you very much. I think maybe it's wise to gather questions from two people, and you can answer them one after another. So Till Peplau and Isabel Sundel will be able to ask their questions. Please remember, it would be very nice to shortly introduce yourself, that we know who is talking.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yes, hello, my name is Till Peplau. I'm doing my master's in Peace and Security in Africa in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and I'm affiliated with the Institute for Strategic Affairs in Ethiopia as well. And thank you very much for the short introduction to the African Union. And I have a question regarding the reform of the African Union. And as far as I'm aware, you can roughly say that there are 3 blocks of countries in the African Union when it comes to the reform. One block being in favor of a reform, one block being opposing a reform, and a third block being on the fence currently. At least that's the last status I've heard so far. I just wanted to know, do you know what's the progress there in the reforms? Because as far as I'm aware, they should already been concluded, or already been basically the structure how to reform it, but I haven't heard anything new. If you have any insight on that, I would be very grateful.
Yeah. So it's been
just a short moment. I think we want to take the question from Isabel Sundel, who should have her microphone activated right now.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my name is Isabel, and I do my PhD at the University of Bayreuth and work at the chair of African Legal Studies. So thank you for your presentation. Actually, I wanted to comment on the first question and your answer. So I really like your approach and being a Pan-Africanist, but I just wondered how realistic your thoughts about bringing all on the same table are. I especially thought about the discussion about the African passport, for example, and how difficult that was. So I did quite some research on regional economic communities, and I would like to get some insights or your opinion on whether this could also be a stage ahead, that African countries focus more on those communities and get smaller units first before focusing on the African Union.
Yeah, thank you for your questions. Maybe I'll begin with the last question and then go forward. So yeah, on the possibility or the potential of having a United States of Africa, or like a single unit, unfortunately, I'm also pessimistic, and I think that will not be happening in this generation of leaders that we have on the continent, sadly, because there is too much grappling of power, there is too much obsession to hold on to power that we see within the governments of African member states now. So although that conversation has been on the table, I know that there was some few years ago where even African diaspora was invited to the African Union to talk about this issue of a possibility of bringing, all member states and having a single region. But yeah, the caliber of African heads of states that we have now, it will not be possible. And like I said, we still have a lot of colonial psychological trauma to deal with before we can even come to the table and talk about the possibility of coming together. Because there is still, the consequences of the divide and rule that was experienced during colonization, and that still persists till today, that you have ethnic groups hating each other. I come from an ethnic group that wanted to secede from Nigeria in 1967. And there was a civil war that broke out about that and, cost a lot of lives for 3 years. So ethnic rivalries is still a huge problem that needs to be discussed, that we haven't discussed as an African continent. And if these things are still, all up in the air and not talked about, the possibility of even coming anything closer to a single entity is still a dream. And yeah, unfortunately on the African passport as well, this is it's still a problem. I remember, during my visiting scholarship in Johannesburg, I had a French friend who we wanted to travel together, and it was easier for her to travel around Southern Africa than it was for me, an African from Nigeria. So it's still a conversation, sadly. There are still, some countries like South Africa kicking about it and not yet, willing to commit to a single African passport. So these are still cases, I would say, historical problems that we are yet to talk about as Africans. And because we have not come around the table to talk about our historical trauma and find a way to resolve or come closer to kind of freeing ourselves from that trauma, we will not in any way get closer to a single entity. And the other question on the reform of the African Union, yes, you are right. The major, SADC, the Southern African states, have rejected it, at first, but these, I think those were mainly for some more of political reasons that I cannot go into. But the latest information that I have on the reform of the African Union is that it's being concluded, implementation hasn't started, but discussions on the reform of the African Union has been concluded.
Great, I hope that all questions were answered to the person's satisfaction to ask them. Now I would like to go back to the Q&A part. We have one question from Marilena Withöft, who asked, earlier you mentioned the case of al-Bashir and the partly discriminative practice by the ICC, International Criminal Court. Do you think the ICC is targeting African countries inappropriately, and is this due to colonial structures, features such as the idea that morality and knowledge in general are coming from the West? And the second question, I think we can also gather here, Dr. Iroulo mentioned the shortcoming of the AU as a saying instead of a doing institution. Especially considering the Silencing the Guns initiative, is there a chance that the AU gets more realistic and closer to an implementing actor within the next years? And what would be concrete steps getting closer to a doing institution?
Yeah, thanks for your questions. So the issue of the International Criminal Court and attacking the African Union, I think it goes back to what I mentioned about the institutional design of the United Nations Security Council. So for a so-called democratic council, it still doesn't represent the peoples of the world. So you have nations who have veto powers, mostly from Europe, the US, and China, and Latin American and African countries, and some of the Asian countries are kicked to the curb. So there are like rotational, non-permanent positions of other member states, but I still argue that there is a need for the United Nations Council. If it were in my position or in my authority to transform the institutional design of the United Nations Security Council, it would be to ensure that there is no permanent seats, there is no veto powers. Every single member state has an equal opportunity to vote, and that member states can rotate the seats. So like, just like we have in the Peace and Security Council, there is a rotation of member states within the United Nations Security Council. And that is why we see what we see in the International Criminal Court. The problem that most African member states and the African Union had was that, the countries that the ICC took on were not even signatories to the ICC. So the fact that they were not signatories to the ICC meant that they had no jurisdiction in that state. But because the UN Security Council had veto powers and could use, could decide on where the ICC could go into, that's what we saw. So that was a major problem. And there are many cases, many instances of conflicts and issues going on within member states that were, forwarded to the International Criminal Court by Africans themselves. So, the African Union or African member states see the relevance of the International Criminal Court. Is not that they don't, it's just that majority of the cases do focus on African states. And this is clearly, the power imbalance that we see in the international community. There is a power imbalance that doesn't just manifest in, the International Criminal Court. It manifests in every sector whatsoever. Like, name it. Is it financial institutions? Is it, international law institutions? Is it even in academia, where I find myself? There is a power imbalance that is manifested based on the fact that there are a group of people who legitimize knowledge and own power, like are the power holders in international communities. That cannot be denied. That is a fact of the world that we live in. We hope for a better world, but we don't see that happening because international relations is all about power grappling. And the next question about implementation of some of the decisions. So like I said, the African Union has always been a sane institution. We can see that in the amount of treaties and new agreements that we have signed, but it's not a doing institution in the sense that like these things are around for so long and we don't necessarily see a change. And this is because there is this solidarity norm, a soft power kind of attributes that the African Union has. They're more of, a guiding institution. They cannot enforce member states to implement decisions. Member states can sign these decisions, but the African Union cannot enforce member states to implement these decisions. And this is a challenge that the organization faces. If the reform could be implemented and more power or authority is given to the African Union, maybe that could change. But if the African Union remains, a weak institution, as I think most member states would rather have it be, then the issue of implementation would still remain a problem.
Thank you. I think we have 3 remaining questions, 2 personal, 1 in the Q&A session. I would ask that John Hogan's microphone is activated so that he can ask his question.
Hello, can people hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so first of all, sorry, my name is John Hogan, and I'm a lecturer from the University of Groningen. And I just would like to thank Dr. Iroulo for the presentation so far. I did my my PhD focused on the African peace and security architecture, and it's been really nice to get a refresher on it and to listen to the conversation. What I wanted to ask about is, you mentioned as part of your discussion of the reforms, the fairly recent reforms, that there's efforts made, and there's some positive indications already that the African Union could move more towards financial autonomy, so financial independence from its external donors. And it's very early days yet, but I would just love to hear what you think the outcome of that would be if it was to continue moving in this direction more towards financial autonomy, particularly in a security context. What types of changes would you expect to see if the main funders of African Union peace missions, for example, were African states as opposed to external donors like the EU?
Yeah. So yeah, thank you very much for that question.
I think we have two other questions I would like to get them together because I think that those are going to be our last ones. Isabel Sundel has another question.
Sorry, I do not have another question.
Oh, okay. Then we have one remaining question in the Q&A. How does the African Union see China's presence or buying power in Africa with the recent boycotting? Sorry, the question just with the recent boycotting against Chinese products and ideology in the West. How does the AU perceive Chinese political ideologies?
Oh, okay. I'll start with the last question. So how does the Chinese perceive, how does the African Union perceive Chinese ideological opinions? It's a difficult question to answer because if you're asking about the African Union, there is a secretariat and then there are member states. It is difficult to say what the African Union itself, the secretariat, thinks about Chinese ideologies, because I don't know what their official position is on that. But in terms of member states and some of the people within member states that I've interacted with, China is just a good alternative. I think that's one of their positions. So, you know, if we cannot get it from the EU and we cannot get it from the United States, we have another alternative. And there is, the idea also is that, you know, the relationship between European countries or the EU is different from that of China. So the European countries, you know, are still made up of some of the people who used to be colonial masters to these member states. So there is this kind of perception that the EU comes with an attitude of, we give you the money, this is what we want you to do, and then you have to do it. And then, like, there is no conversation about it. You get the money, and this is a condition attached to that funding. Whereas with the Chinese, it's more, they argue that there is more room for them to negotiate and more agency for them. So, this is kind of like what I get so far from my research in terms of their, you know, their position with China. A lot of people still do not like it, you know, in terms of grassroots Africans, how it affects their you know, their businesses and society. But I think the major kind of position on China is that is a favorable alternative where we can actually negotiate. In terms of what the AU would look like if these reforms are to be implemented. So talking to the practitioners that I do interact with, the challenge that they face is that they say they lose agency, especially when you have about 90% of the peace and security mission funded from the outside. So they lose a lot of their agency. It becomes a lot more about what funders or external donors say and not what African member states or the African Union wants. So if they are able to implement the 0.02 levy and also get member states to be committed to always paying their dues every year, yeah, it will be great to have some. I don't think in the near future we will be totally independent of external funding, but if they can be more than 50% independent from external funding, then, you know, the African agency, you know, policies that, you know, these practitioners work every day to come up with can be implemented, and it won't be a back and forth with it between what, you know, Africans want and what external funders want. Yeah.
Okay, I think if all the different questions are answered and there are no remaining questions so far, not in person or in question and answer section, I think that we can come to an end now. First of all, Dr. Iroulo, thank you very much for taking your time to introduce, I think, many of our participants to the African Union, its origins, its structure, and its purpose. I'm sure that a lot of people have, or all our participants have learned a lot from your input and from your elaborations regarding the questions. Now I will go back to my presentation. So in case you liked our seminar, I would like to present some seminars that will take place in the coming weeks. Unfortunately, both of them will be in German. Yeah, unfortunately, we can't change that. So first of all, we're going to have a seminar on climate change and security, or the absence of security, with Dr. Christina Kohler. And in October, we are going to have our Advanced Academy on Security Studies or Security Policy. This year, it's going to be about the People's Republic of China. This is going to be an online seminar over 4 days with a lot of high quality speakers. So if you want to participate, you have to apply. In addition to this, we encourage you to visit our website to get an overview over our events. Additionally, you will find a list of the local university groups on our website as well, if you want to become part of the Academic Association for Security Studies. These were my closing remarks. I thank you very much for your participation and wish you all a nice evening and tomorrow a lovely weekend.